We come now to Nadine Gordimer's short fiction masterpiece, The Moment Before the Gun Went Off, a narrative defining history. The story is based in realism, but it's fused with a strong political intent which we can discern despite the old shibboleth of the intentional fallacy, the notion of a couple of literary critics named Beardsley and Wimsatt that the intention in a work of literature cannot truly be determined. This work is all point of view. We know, for example, that Gordimer was a very strong opponent to apartheid. I want to get into that, but nevertheless, the story's narrator is a racial bigot. He's a supporter of apartheid, of the policies that were apparent at a time when those policies of racial exclusion and segregation based on race were being dismantled. That's the moment, the historical moment of this story, which was first published in 1988, 3 years before Nadine Gordimer was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for, and I'm quoting from the award itself, her magnificent epic writing, which was cited as being of great benefit to humanity. Now here's a writer who was quite political, but nevertheless creates a realistic story, a credible story that we believe that is shaped by a point of view antithetical to hers. It really is a testament, again, to her masterfulness as a storyteller, that she can bring this off and that she can bring it out without moralizing, but nevertheless bring a political intent into the fabric, into the warp and woof of the narrative. This story appeared in 1991 in a collection of short stories called Jump, the year following the abolition of apartheid, and it focused on ordinary South Africans. In essence, The Moment Before the Gun Went Off is about a young black farmhand named Lucas being accidentally shot and killed by a freak accident that involves a gun discharging. The youth is 20 years old. He's in the truck of Marius van der Vyver, who's an Afrikaner farmer, and who is also leader of the pro-apartheid political party. Van der Vyver seemed to have developed a bond with this, quote, black boy, and to have taken on a role as a friend and a mentor. What we discover, tragically, is that the boy is actually Van der Vyver's son. Nadine Gordimer was the daughter of Jewish immigrants. As I said, an anti-apartheid activist, apartheid being that system that for many years reigned in South Africa based on race separation, race exclusion, and race as the central determining factor for individual rights. Gordimer said in an often quoted line from a 1965 essay, "A writer in South Africa," which first appeared in London Magazine, "politics is character in South Africa." And you can again see political intent in her work at the same time that she's able to absent herself and remove herself in a voice that is not hers, and a voice which is distinctly antithetical in its political opinion of hers, and yet nevertheless convey what needs to be conveyed. There's almost sympathy in some of her stories for some of the apartheid supporters, for their humanity, for the way they're maimed also by a system that's inhuman. She was born in a mining town called Springs. In 1923, she settled in Johannesburg after receiving an education but not graduating from Witwatersrand University. Gordimer published her first story at the age of 15, and she once commented that not even winning the Nobel Prize was as thrilling as seeing a story of hers in print at that age. Her first collection of stories, Face to Face, was published in 1949. She once remarked that, quote, "the short story is the literary form of our age," end quote. But she's also written many novels and essays and has been awarded a host of honors in addition to the Nobel Prize, including the Booker Prize and the Orange Prize. That's a prestigious UK, United Kingdom literary prize for the best original novel by a woman of any nationality writing in the English language. And of interest here is the fact that Gordimer refused to accept shortlisting on the Orange Prize in 1988 for political reasons, because it was awarded only to women. This was someone who was certainly not afraid of taking political stands, and strong and passionate ones. She was also awarded a literary prize by the French Legion of Honor. And in a 1968 international symposium on the short story, which was published in the Kenyan Review, she commented as to how the short story's presentation of discrete moments makes it true to the lived experience of modern life. It's well worth noting that she said, quote, "Short story writers see by the light of the flash. Theirs is the art of the only thing that one can be sure of, the present moment. Ideally, they have learned to do without explanation of what went before and happens after this point," end of quote. Well, what went before the gun went off is really the key to this story. I want to talk a bit more about Gordimer, though. 3 of her books were actually banned during the apartheid years. And she built a good deal of her distinguished literary career writing about the moral and political as well as the psychological dimensions of living under apartheid, which throughout her adult life she opposed fiercely. In fact, she was a member of the Black-led African National Congress when that group was officially banned and considered revolutionary under the Afrikaners. And she was a longtime friend and supporter of the ANC leader Nelson Mandela, who would become head of the state in South Africa. That was, of course, after apartheid was abolished. Despite her strong political views, which included anti-censorship activism, serving as vice president of PEN International and working on behalf of causes related to HIV/AIDS, Gordimer was not polemical in this story and is not polemical in most of her stories. She begins with the shocking lead sentence, Marius van der Wyver shot one of his farm laborers dead, and then presents the story from this point of view of a friend of van der Wyver's who's never named, a neighbor of his who still believes in apartheid and sees the changes from its being dismantled as hastening chaos. The story is really ultimately about one of what Gordimer once called those backyard relationships, miscegenation, love between black and white that took place furtively, secretly, but was never acknowledged during the apartheid years and in fact was outlawed. Gordimer, we should say, was strongly influenced as a short fiction writer by Chekhov in her strong allegiance to realism and her avoidance of moralizing. But another major influence was a political theorist, a Hungarian Marxist, philosopher, literary critic named Lukács, who believed in realism as a form of social criticism. Lukács saw social existence as determining consciousness and literary art as a mirror for that. He perceived the importance of the contrast of a character's appearance of consciousness as opposed to the reality underlying that appearance of an independent reality. We've often seen in literature, of course, this distinction between appearance and reality. It's at the heart of many great short stories, many short story masterpieces. But it's as if underneath the reality is another reality, and that's a lot of what this great story keys us into. The story, again, is set as apartheid is beginning to crumble, and the narrative defines and clarifies that historical moment. The Immorality Act, as it was called, prohibited miscegenation between the races. It was wiped out by the time this story unfolds. It was, in fact, repealed in 1985. We're told by the narrator, not without disapproval, that it is now lawful and permissible for blacks and whites to sleep together. Violent acts are being carried out by blacks against whites, as the narrator makes us aware of urban police stations burning down and the necessity for security and barbed wires. In fact, van der Wyver has one. He's a white farmer, and this is commonplace for white farmers. Van der Wyver, we're informed early on by the narrator, serves as commandant of the local security commando. So what we get from the point of view of the narrator is the sense again of racial division, of racial separation, of a white man who views black people from a tainted apartheid perspective and who views them, well, at least in terms of those who are causing trouble, as troublemakers. Broader perspectives are successfully dramatized in the story by Gordimer's providing us in the story with this point of view. That is, we go beyond what could be a polemical point of view because we actually believe in and are anchored in the point of view of an apartheid supporter. His sympathies are clearly with white supremacy. And the point of view creates an even greater irony and unmasks even more the cruelty and damages wrought by apartheid. Now, you would think on the face of it, since blacks were excluded and mistreated under apartheid and oppressed, that they were the ones who, for the most part, suffered. But this is where we get under that reality and a reality underneath. Because we discover, of course, that white people suffered in different ways as well. Van der Wyver suffers as a result of apartheid, we find out, even though he's one of its strong supporters. Even the narrator, we discover, is damaged by apartheid, even though he's a white supremacist, as is Van der Wyver. The narrator speaks like a white supremacist. He talks about agitators and infiltration. He generalizes in bigoted ways about blacks not protecting their children in the way whites do. And he has a close enough relationship to the story's protagonist, Marius van der Wyver, that he knows family secrets. Now, this is one of the advantages of having this point of view. It's not only an advantage to have the point of view of a man who is a white supremacist to make us see the reality and the invisibility of that reality that is not on the surface, certainly not the reality that, say, the newspaper reporters would make out of a story like this. Here's a white commandant, a apartheid supporter, a black youth is shot at his truck, and it looks very much like blacks being killed by white man and white man being careless and all of that. But we're told, not through Vanderwijver's point of view, but through this man who knows him, that he was weeping in the police station. In fact, the policeman who was interrogating him about the death of young Lucas was humiliated and embarrassed that he should be weeping over this black young man. It's important, again, that we get this from the point of view of his neighbor. And we get the sense, of course, of what the view is of whites toward blacks. We get the sense of a broader perspective as this historical moment takes place, but we also are able to learn the biological relationship of Vanderwijver and the black youth Lucas. It would have been far less effective if, let's say, it were told from Vanderwijver's point of view. I lost my son. It would have given away everything from the beginning. And the narrator is also part of this wider farming community that understands to a deeper degree what Vanderwijver experiences. What he experiences, again, is completely antithetical to the news reports or the political way that is inferred from the world at large in terms of this particular tragedy, or the way they might infer about this particular tragedy. There's a lot of irony in the story. There's irony, for example, in the Afrikaner narrator's belief that the worldview outside his community is a polarized one, being all black and white. Why is that ironic? It's ironic because the apartheid system has been exactly that, totally polarized into black and white. The narrator becomes a human being in many ways for us, despite, well, what might be our lack of sympathy with his views. And his human view of what underlies the surface is different than what can so easily be construed and ultimately politicized. That appearance is far different, in other words, than the reality that he sees. But the reality that he sees is not really the reality. Again, the masterfulness of this story and the point of view being the integral and most important element to that point of view, to that. He doesn't see the reality beneath his own reality, which is one of moral evil, one of the consequences of apartheid. We learn from the narrator, again, how Vanderwijver and the young mother of Lucas communicate at the gravesite. We don't know yet at that point that they had been lovers. We don't know yet that Vanderwijver is Lucas's father. But we're seeing things freshly and through the eyes of the narrator, who is the neighbor and friend and fellow farmer, white farmer. Vanderwijver is a leading member of the ruling party, but he's also a victim of apartheid. He's a man who, ironically, we discover from learning of his paternity, broke this law against miscegenation that existed under apartheid. And the Gordimer title story of her 1991 volume, Jump, is instructive here as well, for in it we meet a post-colonial white military operations head who discovers how blacks were actually treated under apartheid, under the apartheid regime. After apartheid is swept away, he is tortured and besieged by images of the kind of carnage that was wrought by the policies that he was complicitous in establishing. The point is, as Gordimer shows in work both before and after apartheid, suffering was endured from both sides of the color line because of this system, this wicked system of apartheid and all that it engendered. And when I say that Gordimer does all this without being polemical, I simply mean that she gives us the point of view of those who feel guilty, of those who feel struck by their conscience, of those who suffer in one way or another, even though they were complicitous, even though they were part of the apartheid structure. We learn about Vanderwijver from the narrator, and yet the narrator in many ways can be seen as unreliable. He's unreliable because he's bigoted, for one thing. He's unreliable also because, well, he's not a man that we necessarily trust because of that bigotry. He nevertheless is able to create for us a sense of round characterization of Vanderwijver, of the subtleties of this man's character. Make someone who on the face of it would seem worthy of condemnation, like in the story Jump, someone who is a part of the regime, but nevertheless who becomes more human. When we think about Vanderwijver weeping in the police station after we finish the story, we think about a father weeping for the loss of his son. And so how cruel that system of apartheid was, even though Vanderwijver was a staunch supporter of it. We find out a lot about Vanderwijver from the narrator, even though the narrator, as I said, is not one that we necessarily sympathize with any more than we sympathize with Vanderwijver because of his politics, and yet we sympathize with both perhaps because of their humanity. The narrator is very confused about all of this that's happening in the wake of apartheid being dismantled, the kind of protests that are going on, landmines, almost revolutionary type of actions. Remember that Rhodesia had changed into Zimbabwe, and there was a lot of land taken away under Robert Mugabe, taken away from the white farmers. And there's a great deal of fear and apprehension underneath the story that's being told by this white farmer. And the farmers feeling they have to protect their land, they have to protect what's theirs from essentially this wave of change that's bringing with it Mandela and bringing with it black nationalism and the African National Congress, which was revolutionary and was outlawed and did believe at one time in violent overthrow. It's an extraordinary, well, something almost that can't be believed on the face of it. If you remember back to before apartheid, that things happened the way they did without there being even more bloodshed, without being a tidal wave of bloodshed. We find out about Vanderwijver's early shyness from this narrator, and also about his relationship with his father, his belief that a farmer's sacred duty, for example, is to raise game as well as cattle. And we discover from the narrator how his mother felt Vanderwijver didn't mix adequately with other children when he was a boy, which his wife, Elida, felt kept him from becoming his party's candidate for the district. Irony in that phrasing about not mixing well, of course. It's also a subtle but ironic and revelatory touch that Elida, his wife, is dressed out of respect at the boy's funeral, as she would for a white funeral. It's so remarkable because that captures the moment of change that we're going through historically. For a white woman to dress like she would for a white funeral for a black boy would have been unheard of, totally unacceptable. But she realizes that this boy's death has taken its toll on her husband. And we realize that not only by the fact that she's dressed for a white as a testament, but we realize that also by dint of the fact that we've learned already what kind of effect it's had on him, is weeping in the police station. Now, her wife might think he's just a kind of surrogate son, but we know, of course, and find out at the end, that he's the actual son. We learn of Vanderwijver's teaching Lucas hunting and tractor maintenance, and the fact that the boy is killed by Vanderwijver's father's rifle, and that's another symbolic link to the apartheid past. This is transgenerational. There was, of course, in South Africa, a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop, was involved in this, and many white South Africans like Gordimer were involved in it as well. But there's a sense behind these stories that all of the truth has to be told, just like there was in the Truth and Reconciliation, that you go back generations and you go back to some of the horrors of Stephen Biko and some of these so-called agitators who were heroes, of course, to the blacks in South Africa, and the torture that went on and the killings that went on, and you begin to realize, again, that Gordimer is trying to tell these stories, but trying to tell them not in a way that would say all is black and white, because there are many shades of gray, and they're moral shades of gray. It's one of the astonishing things about many of these short story masterpieces is that they show us worlds that are morally gray, worlds that are ambivalent. The pacing of the story is inevitable, but it's fluid in its representation of time. The story moves from the fact of Lucas's death and how it happened to the funeral, and then once again back in time to that moment before the gun went off. And the trajectory of the story ultimately moves back to that moment before the gun went off. And the fact of the death, and the final O. Henry-like revelation from the narrator, which almost seems like the kind of effect one might imagine if a shot were actually set off or fired. It's again, I think, a credit to Gordimer's craft that she can handle the time shift so adroitly and successfully. It keeps our suspense, it keeps us wondering what happens, but it also has that jolt at the end that almost seems like a shock when we find out about the paternity. This story is pretty gripping. It's well told, but it also is infused with politics, make no mistake about that. Not necessarily intentionally trying to persuade us politically, but having a message about the way stories are told in public versus how they truly unfold, and the actual historical reality underneath the stories. In that sense, this is, like Atwood's story, another story about storytelling and how stories get told. Stories get told, well, because there's a public way that stories are perceived. Newspapers, for example, gossip, the point of view that may be biased, in this case black or white, whatever the case may be, the story seems to be telling us that there is another reality underneath that, another reality underneath the political reality that sees things often in black and white and says, this is good, this is evil. Much more complicated than that, much more multidimensional than that. And the persona, or the unreliable narrative point of view, is really quite remarkably effective. It's reminiscent of a famous novel by Ford Madox Ford called The Good Soldier, which also is a classic example of an unreliable narrator. The accidental death of the young black boy, Lucas, becomes a centerpiece of a kind of dismantling of the historical legacy of apartheid and allowing us to see the humanity of both sides and the suffering of both sides because of it. Gordimer's craft is of a high order. Everything from the scene paintings to the characterizations, the way she uses irony, even the employment of details such as the police captain, the one that Van der Vyver weeps in front of, writing passed on about Van der Vyver's father's death. Just a little detail like that, the euphemism of passed on. Or for that matter, the police captain's sympathy, what would seem his sympathy, which is tempered by the fact that he can't believe this man is weeping over the loss of a black man, black boy. Gordimer combines great storytelling with a strong political message about the evil of apartheid, but without stepping in, without moralizing, without creating any sense of a homily or a sermon, without, in other words, being overtly didactic. And she even makes us aware from the story's outset of issues such as, well, the dangers of father's guns lying around homes and of hunting accidents. It's not necessarily that she's for gun control or anything like that, but she's really bringing us into a whole picture of how accidents happen, of how things take place. She's not saying, in other words, we should have gun control or anything even along those lines, talking like Americans do about NRA Second Amendment rights and all that sort of thing. She's just saying that, carelessness can lead, where guns are concerned, to death. But the real greatness of the story emerges from its sense of history, its ability to engender in us the historical narrative that is linked to a personal story. Again, as we've seen in so many of these stories, of ordinary people. We're able to see the macrocosm in the microcosm. We're able to see through the telescope and the microscope, through the type of, in this story, tragic accident that can and does occur every day, but that has much lying underneath it. The story also dramatizes, in a very deft way, the chasm that exists between the private world and what is made public after the gun goes off. Listen to this final paragraph. And remember, this is from our narrator whom we've met, who is somewhat dissociated from Van der Vyver, just a neighbor, but acquainted with him, wanting to tell his story, wanting to tell what he believes is the real story. But the irony underneath his unreliability, of course, is the story that's underneath that. How will they ever know when they file newspaper clippings, this is the narrator, evidence, proof, when they look at the photographs and see his face, guilty, guilty? They are right. How will they know when the police stations burn with all the evidence of what has happened now and what the law made a crime in the past? How could they know that they do not know anything? The young black callously shot through the negligence of the white man was not the farmer's boy. He was his son. So there you have it. There you have this narrator who is against the uprising, against the attempt to bring apartheid to a close completely, not even willing to accept the fact that there was an immorality act that was taken away, feeling in fact that blacks and whites should not be having sex or sexual union, should not be lovers. But yet he captures something here that's really quite real. That is, this might be looked at as a young black callously shot through the negligence of a white man. That might indeed be, given the political polarization, the way it's perceived. But the political polarization exists because of apartheid. There's, of course, the reality underneath that. And the political and underneath the reality of what is perceived, he's right, is the fact that this is the man's son. So we get the emotional wallop at the end of the story. We get the sense of a kind of push almost into another realm, into a realm which shakes us and makes us awaken to the fact that there are perceptions that we don't see on the surface. Not only of someone who is biased and whom we might disapprove of in terms of those biases, not only in terms of the public view of things as opposed to the private view, but in terms of what we would call reality, reality itself. Again, this story harkens us back to the whole notion of what storytelling is and the reality underneath it. When we talked about Margaret Atwood, we talked about the reality underneath fiction, which is the reality of death. But the reality underneath fiction goes deeper than just the recognition of death. The reality of fiction, which reflects life, which brings life forward, also shows us that in life there are other realities underneath, beyond what we see. And this makes for greater ambiguity, greater moral ambiguity. When we come to the end of the story, it certainly carries with it a punch, but it also carries with it a kind of epiphany or recognition. It becomes another story about understanding how stories are told and how stories are created. In that sense, it's self-reflexive. It's not the metafiction of Margaret Atwood. It's a very realistic and realistically grounded story, but nevertheless, it's a story that brings us once again into that sphere, into that realm, and makes us aware of storytelling and makes us aware how stories are created. We've seen a lot of tragic stories, certainly, but we're going to go next to a much more upbeat story with an ending that is climactic, just like this story, but which, with its climax, brings us an uplifting sense, almost really what I somewhat hesitatingly would call a spiritual sense. It's by a contemporary writer who is younger than Nadine Gordimer, who wrote a story that preceded the moment before the gun went off. We're going a little backward chronologically here, but we're going forward in the sense of a writer who can create an ending that can really lift us, almost literally lift us. Raymond Carver is often deemed, like Nadine Gordimer, to be one of the greatest story writers of the 20th century. He's an American writer of working class background, often compared also to Chekhov. And we come back to the importance of Chekhov, singular in short story writing, often called the father of the modern short story. We see his influence in Gordimer in terms of the not moralizing in her story, but we see a different kind of influence in Raymond Carver, which we'll talk about when we talk about that story. That's a little play on what we talk about when we talk about Love, which was the name of his second volume. But this is his best known short story. It's from his third volume, from his last volume actually, of short stories. And it's the next story that we're going to deal with, and it's called Cathedral.